I Wear My Sunglasses at Night. Written by Paul Aster Cohen. Narrated by Nicky. Chapter 8. He shoved the cart down the aisles like a crazy woman on a game show where she had 30 seconds to grab items on her list to win $10,000. She snapped her head up and down each shelf, grabbing whatever she needed: duct tape, chains, an axe, another axe, then figured why not just grab one more for good measure. She tossed in a nail gun, a few saw blades, a handful of metal locks, and slid to a halt when she came to the area filled with stacks of wood. She got lucky with the garden stakes at the motel, but they were too weak to carry into battle. She left her cart at the beginning of the section and jogged down the wood piles before finding the rounded dowels. She went, size by size, down the display until she came to the ones that were large enough to grip easily. She grabbed a young guy in an orange apron chatting with a customer and drug him down the aisle. "Can I get 50 of these cut and sharpened to a point?" she demanded to the frightened worker. Yeah, I think. Sure." She shoved an armful of the wooden sticks into his arms and headed back to her cart. "I'll be back in a minute, just get to work." She tore off towards the cashier stations, slid to a stop, and quickly returned to the bewildered young man still standing where she left him. "Faster than that, man!" He galloped off towards the woodworking machines, nearly dropping some and awkwardly grabbing them before they hit the floor. Nodding, Nicky bolted towards the front of the store again. She rolled her eyes as she came to a sudden stop behind an old woman standing in the longest line she had ever seen. Her foot began tapping like a meth addict at her dealer's house. Nicky nervously looked up and down and all around the store for the dwarf and the man who took Derek, as her thumbs tapped the shopping basket in sync with her foot. The old woman looked back at her carefully before grabbing her purse from the cart, gripping it tightly against her saggy chest. Then Nicky saw him, the dwarf with no name. He was creeping out from the side of a shelf, motioning at her. He was pointing to something, then motioning to duck or dive or maybe even run. His short limbs would have made him the worst charades partner. As she mimicked his uncoordinated motions, she elbowed something. She turned to apologize to the old woman, expecting to receive a talking to, along with a toothless scowl. But instead, she saw the man. The guy she'd only seen once, behind Derek, twisting his arms behind his back, trying to get him out of the room. He was actually standing behind her, wearing big dark sunglasses and what looked like way too much sunscreen. She turned back around, her hands gripping the handle of the cart hard. So hard, in fact, that her veins nearly burst from the tops of her hands. Her eyelids slowly slid down, the corner of her mouth curled upwards like Dirty Harry when he got angry. Rage cascaded over her eyes, the world a deep scarlet color of vengeance. Her teeth ground against each other hard. Her biceps twitched and shook. Every one of her muscles pulsed and flexed. Her thoughts snapped back to the night before. All she could see was that large guy behind Derek, her man afraid, this man smirking. She didn't even notice the dwarf waving at her, trying to tell her to keep calm and not do anything irrational. But it was too late. Nicky snapped her head to one side, cracking her neck. She hadn't made a full turn when she found her stomach on the receiving end of the man's massive boot, sending her skidding across the smooth concrete floor of the home improvement store, whacking her head on multiple tool displays. She saw the dwarf following her with his eyes as she slid on by. Turns out he remembered her too. The large man leapt high into the air and bounded from checkout conveyor belt to conveyor belt towards her. Her fingers clawed at the floor until she finally stopped, hair on the back of her head matted with blood. She hopped to her feet and braced herself for a fight. But the man was too fast. From the last register, he flung himself at her, Nicky barely able to keep out of the way. Before she could once again get to her feet, an enormous fist clipped her jaw, dispatching her into an end cap full of belt sanders, her body sent spinning like a drunken ballerina. Her face slapped the hard floor. She sucked in air, somehow got to her feet, and grabbed one of the tool's cords. Nicky's arm was stuck next to her leaking face as she attempted to swing one of the sanders, not realizing it was attached to the display. Shit. Another fist, this one connecting to her already bruised gut, and she heard more than a few cracks coming from her ribs. Nicky fell to one knee, curled in pain. A hand nearly the size of her skull gripped her head and smashed it into the glass cabinet under the tool display, and she was out. The dwarf ran from a few aisles away, screaming, brandishing a pitchfork. The large man, standing over the girl, who now looked like she was making snow angels on the floor, but with blood instead of snow, laughed. He slowly backed away as the dwarf stood over her, jabbing in his direction, trying to keep him from inflicting any more damage to the unconscious girl.
"I'd stay away if I were you two,"
the massive man shouted.
"This does not concern either of you now. Don't force our hand."
Nicky's head raised, her hair now a rich ruby color, stuck to the floor. With her one good eye, she saw a large blurry figure turn to run.
"Stay down, girl, if you know what's good for you,"
the dwarf warned. With shaky arms and legs, she got to her feet as the figure neared the exit. Without looking, she grabbed a 2x4 from someone's cart and chunked it at him with all her might. The thick board sailed through the air and managed to wedge itself in between the figure's legs, successfully tripping him up and causing him to skim through the sliding exit doors on his face. Nicky smiled, got to her feet, and took off after him, limping on a busted knee and gripping some cracked ribs. The large man, unsure of what exactly just happened, shook his skinned face and got to his feet. As soon as he was out from under the building's awning, his face began to sizzle. He growled, realizing most of the sunscreen was left on the cement floor. He attempted to shield his skinned face, now spewing smoke, as he ran back and forth in front of the store, trying to remember where he parked. A board smacked him in the back of the head, bursting into splinters, causing him to stumble forward. He turned, his serrated teeth ripping his lower lip as they burst from shredded gums, and locked eyes with the girl he never planned on seeing again.
"Shit!"
Nicky threw the remaining piece of wood at the man and winced. For anyone not sure what was going on, it must have looked like someone was being shot out of a cannon at a circus. Only there was no circus, and no cannon, but there was a body flying through the air, clear across the parking lot, landing right in front of her car. Shecky howled, caught in the gap of the driver's side window as his claws scraped the glass wildly. Nicky shuddered, only one arm working now. She puked a huge pool of bloody chunks but continued to try to rise up, face the bastard that took Derek. Through her blood-soaked hair, her good eye only allowing a sliver of vision, she saw a man with a cart, frozen in terror nearby. Inside his cart was something she desperately wanted, needed. When she tried to ask him to toss it to her, she just threw up more blood. That sent him fleeing with a terrified, shrill scream. But he left the cart, and its contents, so she was good. The vampire, now more monstrous than human, stomped towards her, his body billowing smoke, anger tattooed across his face, drool dripping in long strings from his mouth. The man paused. A sound was coming from behind him. Someone was yelling. It was a small yell, but a yell nonetheless. The giant man turned to see the dwarf racing towards him, still wielding the pitchfork. The man laughed at the sight and distance of which his little legs would have to travel to reach him. Shaking his head, the man turned his attention to the girl a few vehicles from him. Shecky continued to battle the car window, howling and foaming at the mouth as the man now stood over what was left of Nicky. She was a trembling, battered mess of her former self.
"Should have just listened, girl."
He spat down at her through a mouthful of razor-sharp chompers.
"I'm sure."
A swish, a splatter, and a clink. The man stumbled back, unsure what had caused him to stop talking, and found something missing from his face. His eyes studied his bloody hands, then searched for his missing piece. Scattered on the asphalt next to him, a machete. Next to the machete, his jaw. Next to his jaw, his tongue. "Thank goodness for the store's free blade sharpening service. Bitch." She managed to garble between deep, hard breaths. Her fingers crawled over to the machete, which she used to help her get to her feet. She looked nothing like she had earlier that day. She was a freely peeled scab. With busted limbs, she resembled a scarecrow after a violent windstorm. Inside her chest were just 2 busted balloons, her cavity full of liquid. The The blows the man delivered smashed everything inside, bursting her lungs, bones, spleen, and guts. She was a bag of meat. Watching the large man bleed out made her a content bag of meat, but she wasn't done just yet. The world around faded in and out. In the distance, she swore she saw the dwarf running towards her, shaking his head, shouting something, but wasn't sure. Her head bobbed and swayed on cracked vertebrae as she tried to keep it steady. She looked up at the thing, running his fingers through the bloody pieces that hung from its jowl, and something else was there, too. Long, chipped, sharp. Teeth. The sound of the screaming dwarf was close, and as she threw her arms around the jawless beast's gory neck, she heard the small men yell, "Don't do it! Nicky, stop!" Her final breath left her body in the form of a sigh as she dug the long, horrid fangs into her neck. 1,000 years of ancient lineage surged through her veins, causing her to seizure and convulse as the primordial poison curdled what blood she had left, as she died yet was reborn at the same instant. Her eyes burst open wide and spewed lumpy tears of blood. Bones cracked and healed, scrapes and cuts closed, dropping pieces of wood and metal and glass at her feet. Her frame straightened as her chest inflated and organs put themselves back in place. Her visions were vivid dreams cascading over her burning eyes. Nicky could see the history of the world through their eyes, immense battles of long bygone eras. From clubs and stone weapons brandished by ape men to horses and men with spears, to armies clad in metal armor, the virus that coursed through her veins had lived more than a millennia, until it met the ultimate host. She saw a king, clutching a broken sword, raised high into the sky, a crown of flames above his head. His armor dented, cracked, caked in the blood of the fallen, and from it a crimson cape, tattered, torn, and burnt, blew over a mountain of bodies as far as the eye could see. On a throne of wriggling bodies he held a goblet overflowing with his own blood. The king drank from the cup and spat out its contents. Those close enough to be called allies were covered in the spray and were born again in the fire and blood of the one who was more man than any who had ever walked the earth. A new god. Primeval cities bowed to him, their masses shivering in fear at his power. Crossing oceans, he stood at the bow of wooden ships carved to look like prehistoric serpents that hissed and growled and spewed fire, writhing through the water. The king stepped onto foreign sand which turned to glass beneath his boot. In his eyes, staring deep into her own, she saw hundreds of cowled reapers flowing across the sky, swooping down to take women, men, and children, screaming and crying to their doom. He grinned a wild, terrifying grin at her, and she shut her eyes. When they opened, the world around her snapped back into focus. Sprawled on the asphalt, she winced in pain as her skin began to burn in the midday sun. She blinked, held her hand in front of her face, and studied her healing bones as they shifted and popped underneath her sizzling skin. She jumped to her feet and looked over at the jawless man, his teeth just inside of her, and grinned the king's grin. His eyes grew wide, her new fangs cutting her lower lip. "Bye-bye, fucker," she said, delivering a kick to his groin that launched him high into the air and over the parking lot. She watched as he landed with a muffled thud somewhere near a convenience store across the street, a lot further than she intended. The dwarf finally made it to her.
"What did you do?"
he shouted, doubling over to catch his breath, dropping the pitchfork.
"What did you do?"
"I didn't mean to kick him that hard. Man, he went sailing, huh?" she said, shielding her eyes as she looked off into the distance.
"Not that. The bite.
"Oh, right. I just evened the odds. Chill."
"That's not good, girl. You'll be damned. Forever."
What else was I supposed to do? He was beating the shit out of me. I was about to die. These things are too strong, too fast. I had no choice but become one of them. She began to replay the images that were just so real, spilling before her eyes. These things have been around forever.
"What?"
"Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "Anyway, it was the best idea I had at the time. And where were you?"
I was coming.
Guess I should find that guy and get some answers. Damn, wish I didn't kick him so far. Now I have to find him. She glared off into the distance. Shit. Nicky blinked and tried to focus, but the light was becoming too bright. Her vision was blurry and quickly growing bright white. The big man's sunglasses were laying next to her car's tire, and she quickly grabbed them and put them on. They split in two and fell off. Well, damn. She turned to the direction of the store and stomped off towards the entrance.
Where are you going now?
The dwarf shouted. Get the dog, I'll be right back.
He's never mind.
The dwarf turned to see Shecky half hanging out of the car window, staring back at him, motionless and embarrassed, and rushed over to help him.